What happens when the world's most comprehensive sanctions regime not only fails to destroy its target, but actually makes it stronger? I'm John Maersheimer, and for over 4 decades I've studied how great powers rise and fall. What I'm witnessing right now defies everything Western policymakers believed about economic warfare. Professor Jeffrey Sachs has just delivered the most devastating analysis of Western strategy I've ever encountered. His warning isn't speculation. It's an autopsy of a failed empire. The sanctions designed to cripple Russia have backfired so catastrophically that they're reshaping global power itself. While Washington celebrates tactical victories, Moscow is winning a completely different war, and the West doesn't even realize it's losing. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, I watched Western leaders make the same fatal error I've seen throughout my career. They confused moral outrage with strategic thinking. The response was swift and predictable. The most comprehensive sanctions package in modern history. Asset freezes, swift exclusions, energy embargoes, technology bans. The goal was simple: economic strangulation leading to regime collapse. As a realist, I knew this strategy rested on a dangerous assumption that Russia had no alternatives. But Jeffrey Sachs saw what I saw. The West wasn't fighting the war, it thought it was fighting. While NATO focused on military containment, Russia was playing an entirely different game: the systematic dismantling of Western economic hegemony. And Putin was about to prove that the foundation of American power, dollar dominance, was far more fragile than anyone imagined. The first shock came within weeks. The ruble, which Western analysts predicted would collapse to worthless paper, not only stabilized, but strengthened. By late 2022, it had actually appreciated against the dollar. Russian GDP, forecasted to shrink by 15%, contracted only marginally before rebounding to growth levels that embarrassed Western economists who had staked their reputations on collapse predictions. The regime that was supposed to crumble from internal pressure consolidated power instead. Putin's approval ratings, rather than plummeting due to economic hardship, remained surprisingly stable. The oligarchs who Western strategists expected to turn against the Kremlin instead found new opportunities in redirected trade flows. But these weren't the real surprises. The real earthquake was structural. Sachs identified what he calls strategic adaptation, Russia's systematic pivot away from the West and toward what economists now term the Global South Plus coalition. China, India, Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Indonesia, the UAE, nations representing over half the world's population and a growing share of global GDP. What struck me most was the speed of this reorientation. Trade relationships that typically take decades to build were established in months. Russia-China bilateral trade jumped 30% in the first year alone. India increased Russian oil imports by over 700%. These weren't temporary adjustments. They represented permanent shifts in global economic geography. I've spent decades arguing that in an anarchic international system, states will balance against dominant powers. What I witnessed in 2022 to 2024 was the most rapid great power rebalancing in modern history. And the catalyst wasn't Russian aggression, it was Western overreach. The energy equation tells the story perfectly. Europe, in a fit of what Sachs calls moral arrogance, severed itself from cheap Russian gas overnight. The economic suicide was immediate and devastating. German factories shuttering by the hundreds, French industry relocating to America and Asia, European competitiveness evaporating in a matter of months. Energy costs tripled, then quadrupled in some regions, pushing major manufacturers toward American markets where subsidies and cheaper energy beckoned. I watched entire supply chains collapse in real time. Chemical plants that had operated profitably for decades suddenly became unviable. Steel production, the backbone of European industry, contracted by double digits. The automotive sector, already struggling with electric transition, faced an additional burden of energy costs that made production increasingly uncompetitive against Asian rivals. Meanwhile, Russia redirected its energy flows eastward with remarkable efficiency. Chinese imports of Russian oil hit record levels, with Beijing securing long-term contracts at discounted prices. India became Moscow's largest customer outside China, increasing purchases by over 1,000% within 18 months. Even traditional U.S. allies like Turkey quietly increased energy imports from Russia. But the most significant development was the construction of new pipeline infrastructure. The power of Siberia expansion, new routes through Central Asia, LNG facilities oriented toward Asian markets. Russia was physically rewiring the global energy grid away from Europe. The energy map of Eurasia was redrawn in months, not decades. And Europe, having voluntarily surrendered energy security for moral symbolism, found itself permanently disadvantaged in global manufacturing. But energy was just the beginning. The deeper transformation involves something far more threatening to American hegemony, the dollar system itself. For 80 years, America has enjoyed what economists call exorbitant privilege, the ability to print money that others must accept because international trade requires dollars. This system allowed the U.S. to finance enormous deficits, maintain global military presence, and weaponize sanctions with devastating effect. Sachs warns that this era is ending, not through military defeat, but through systemic bypass. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, have accelerated development of alternative payment systems. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is expanding its financial architecture. Most significantly, major oil producers are accepting payments in yuan, rubles, even rupees instead of dollars. The numbers tell the story. In 2021, roughly 2% of Russia-China trade was conducted in their domestic currencies. By 2024, that figure exceeded 75%. Saudi Arabia, America's oldest Middle Eastern ally, began accepting yuan for Chinese oil purchases, a development that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. The BRICS Plus expansion in 2023 brought in Iran, Egypt, UAE, and Ethiopia, while dozens of other nations applied for membership. This wasn't just diplomatic symbolism, it represented the institutionalization of non-Western financial infrastructure. The new development bank, alternative to the World Bank, the BRICS payment system challenging SWIFT dominance. Each bilateral trade agreement conducted outside the dollar system represents a small crack in American financial hegemony. But the cumulative effect is revolutionary. When enough nations trade without dollars, the entire foundation of American economic power begins to erode. I've calculated the mathematics of this decline. If just 30% of global trade shifts away from dollar denomination, the United States loses the ability to finance its massive deficits through monetary expansion. The consequences would include forced fiscal austerity, reduced military spending, and fundamental restructuring of American global commitments. I've watched this process with the analytical detachment my realist training demands, but also with growing concern. Because what Sachs describes isn't just economic transition, it's the emergence of a genuinely multipolar world order. And historically, such transitions are rarely peaceful. The tragedy is that this outcome was entirely preventable. After the Cold War ended, the West had an opportunity to construct an inclusive international system that reflected new realities. Instead, we doubled down on dominance. NATO expansion, economic coercion, regime change operations, all designed to preserve a unipolar moment that was always temporary. Russia's survival under maximum pressure has sent a signal to every nation on Earth. The West's economic weapons have limits. If Moscow can endure the worst sanctions in history and emerge more self-reliant, why should any country fear Western economic coercion? This realization is spreading faster than any sanction can contain it. From Africa to Asia, from Latin America to the Middle East, governments are quietly diversifying their economic partnerships, reducing dollar dependence, and building relationships with non-Western powers. I've witnessed this shift firsthand during recent academic conferences and policy discussions. Officials from countries across the global South speak openly about hedging strategies, maintaining relationships with the West while expanding alternatives. Nigeria explores yuan-denominated oil sales. Bangladesh increases rupee trade with India. Argentina considers BRICS membership. The pattern is unmistakable. Nations are preparing for a post-American world order not through revolution, but through gradual decoupling from Western-dominated systems. Sachs calls this the awakening of sovereignty. Nations rediscovering that they have choices. The monopolar world where Washington dictated terms is being replaced by a multipolar reality where power is distributed among several centers. But the transformation goes deeper than economics. It's psychological, cultural, civilizational. For 3 decades, Western values, institutions, and development models were presented as universal and inevitable. Now alternative pathways to prosperity and governance are proving viable. China's Belt and Road Initiative has connected over 140 countries through infrastructure investments totaling more than $1 trillion. Unlike Western development aid, which often comes with political conditions about governance and economic reform, Chinese investment focuses primarily on tangible infrastructure. Ports, railways, telecommunications networks. The results are visible across the developing world. African cities connected by Chinese-built railways. Central Asian nations linked through energy pipelines. South American countries accessing Pacific markets through Chinese-funded ports. Europe finds itself the biggest loser in this transition. Having surrendered strategic autonomy to American leadership, European nations now discover they lack both the military capability to defend themselves and the economic flexibility to adapt. The continent that once dominated global affairs has become a strategic backwater, dependent on American energy, at triple the cost of Russian alternatives they voluntarily abandoned. The psychological impact runs deeper than economics. For 30 years, Western elites believed their model was inevitable, their values universal, their dominance permanent. Sachs shatters these illusions with clinical precision. The world no longer needs Western permission to prosper. Alternative models of development, governance, and international relations are proving viable. This shift terrifies Western establishments because it strikes at the heart of their identity. If American hegemony isn't destiny, if Western values aren't universal, if other civilizations can chart independent courses, then what justifies continued dominance? The answer increasingly is nothing. And that realization is driving Western foreign policy toward increasingly desperate measures. But here's what worries me most as a security scholar. Desperate hegemons often resort to force when economic leverage fails. History shows that declining powers frequently choose war rather than accept diminished status. The risk of military escalation grows as economic tools lose their effectiveness. Sachs offers a different path forward, what he calls cooperative multipolarity. Instead of resisting inevitable change, the West could embrace it, helping to construct international institutions that reflect new realities rather than clinging to systems designed for a world that no longer exists. This requires humility that American leaders have rarely displayed. It means accepting that other nations have legitimate interests, that different developmental models can succeed, that diversity of governance doesn't threaten global stability. The alternative is continued confrontation, economic fragmentation, and the risk of conflict between nuclear powers. Because as Sachs warns, the old order is collapsing whether we guide that collapse or not. The question is whether we'll manage this transition wisely or stumble toward catastrophe. Russia's resilience has shattered the myth of Western economic omnipotence. The sanctions that were supposed to demonstrate American power have revealed its limits instead. And across the world, nations are drawing conclusions that will reshape international relations for generations. The tragedy of great power politics is unfolding once again. But this time, the declining hegemon is us. And the question isn't whether we'll adapt to multipolarity. It's whether we'll do so peacefully or through the chaos that historically accompanies imperial collapse. Professor Sachs has delivered his warning. The choice of how we respond remains ours. But time is running out, and the world is moving forward with or without American consent. The age of uncontested dominance is over. The question is, what comes next?